It is such a pleasure to provide opening remarks for the 2021 Coastal Scholars Showcase. Thank you for joining in to celebrate scholarship, the research, writing, and artistic, creative work of our College of Coastal Georgia faculty and staff scholars. You know, as a young college, we've had some catching up to do when it comes to establishing traditions. So with the start of this showcase in 2019, we started a wonderful story, a treasured tradition that's now in its third year and that I look forward to participating in for many years to come. In our first year, we had 23 sessions led by 28 of our faculty and staff scholars from around our campus. Last year, the showcase featured 15 sessions led by 20 faculty and staff members. And this year, we will be wowed by 16 presentations and posters led by 23 faculty and staff members. We owe a debt of gratitude to the members of our campus community who have dedicated hours of energy, brainstorming, and really logistical calisthenics to make it happen. Our Faculty Development Committee and Leadership and Academic Affairs and the Office of Advancement have all contributed. Thank you for your commitment to this extremely important event in the life of the college. So for those of you who aren't with us on a daily basis, you may wonder, what does scholarship look like at the College of Coastal Georgia? And there are a lot of definitions out there, lots of lists of what comprises scholarship. But instead of walking through all the possibilities, I just encourage you to experience it and to find out for yourself. So as you participate in the showcase this year in this virtual format, you will see what scholarship looks like here at the college. So with this year's theme of resiliency and restoration in the face of adversity, promoting growth and educational sustainability, the Planning Committee hopes that this showcase will inspire and guide you on how to persevere through challenging times, and that this showcase will foster a stronger relationship between our college and the broader regional community, creating opportunities for further dialogue and for collaborations on common interests. Speaking of inspirational moments, it's a perfect time to introduce our keynote presentation that will be provided by Dr. David Mulry. Dr. Mulry is a professor of English here at the college. He previously worked in broadcasting with the BBC. He has a PhD in English from the University of Kent, Canterbury. He's previously taught in Greece and in France and the UK before teaching in the United States. And he's published on manuscript revision, along with political fiction and gender and colonialism, on modern and romantic poetry, and on literary modernism. His book, Conrad Among the Anarchists, was published in 2016, and he's recently published articles on Conrad's short fiction, Heart of Darkness, and most recently, a newly discovered letter by the author. He's scheduled to complete his new book very soon. It'll be out later this year. Dr. Mulry's presentation today is titled, In the Shadows of the Heart of Darkness, What Conrad Kept Hidden and What He Revealed. Really looking forward to this keynote presentation and the rest of this showcase. Thank you for being here.
Before I get to the talk today, I just want to say, first of all, I'm very honored to have been selected to speak here. I want to give a shout out to the Faculty Development Committee and their work on this event and the strong support that we receive from President Johnston and Provost Evans as faculty scholars. I want to share a special thank you to Dean Wallace, who's been so supportive of my work over the last few years, and to our wonderful librarians who are so kind and helpful. I'd like especially to recognize the importance of our community partners. We couldn't do what we do without your continued support, and it is very much appreciated. I'd also like to note that I'm very proud to serve among some really fine scholars and fine teachers at this institution. This is one of my favorite events at the school, when I get to see what my colleagues are working on. My talk today is going to be about Joseph Conrad and one of his most famous works, Heart of Darkness. Joseph Conrad and his very English sounding name is a bit of authorial sleight of hand. He was born a Pole, though Poland existed only as a nationalist ideal at the time, since it was partitioned as a colonized space by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Conrad was born Josef Theodor Conrad Korzeniowski in Berdychev, then Russia, on the 3rd of December 1857. He was born to a Polish nationalist poet and zealot, Apollo Korzeniowski, and his wife Eva Bobrowska. The young Conrad grew up in the shadow of his father's struggle against imperialist Russia, and tragedy struck the family when Apollo and his wife were exiled to frozen Vologda. Exiles and their families of these political crimes were expected to suffer, to languish, often to die. In the harsh conditions of that exile, Eva died, and Apollo fell ill. He was allowed to return to northern Ukraine and shortly after to Krakow, leaving Conrad orphaned at the age of 11. Remember the theme of the Scholars' Showcase: resiliency and restoration in the face of adversity. From these unlikely beginnings, Conrad emerged as a novelist. In 1894, at the age of 36, and after a career as a merchant seaman, Conrad became a writer. By this point he had naturalized as an Englishman. He had learned English while serving in the merchant marine. During that time, however, sailing ships were in decline, and the age of steam had depressed employment in the shipping industry, and as steamships grew larger, fewer ships carried more tonnage, and crews grew smaller. The change was reflected in this Turner painting, The Fighting Temeraire, with a steam tug towing a sailing ship to be scrapped. Conrad, having risen through the ranks of his first career and qualified as a ship's captain, was finding employment harder to locate. In this environment, he decided to turn his back on the sea, except in the pages of his fiction. Just 4 years after he left the sea in his new career as an author, and working in his third, and perhaps fourth, language, after Polish, French, perhaps Russian, and finally English, Conrad would begin Heart of Darkness. It was only a matter of a few years before he was being described as one of the greatest writers in the English language. Heart of Darkness is a short novella, originally published as one of 3 long prose pieces in a 1902 book, Youth, a Narrative, and 2 other tales. It wasn't even named in the title of the original volume. Youth, another one of Conrad's great novellas, received title billing, and for many contemporary readers the other piece, The End of the Tether, a personal favourite of mine, was perhaps the strongest of the 3. I don't think many Conrad scholars would argue that Heart of Darkness is his greatest or most important work, but it is one of his most famous and widely accessible pieces because of its prominent, perhaps controversial place in school and university curricula, and it's certainly much written about. While some modern critics may have their reservations about the book, it's caught the imagination of many who've read it. Faulkner described it as one of his favourite books. T.S. Eliot, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, used the most famous phrase from the novella, the horror, as his epigraph to The Wasteland, his seminal modernist poem, though he was persuaded to cut it out by Ezra Pound in revision. If Eliot isn't your cup of tea, Hemingway was also a great fan. In fact, after Conrad's death in 1924, Hemingway invoked Eliot in comparison, writing, "If I knew that by grinding Mr. Eliot into a fine, dry powder and sprinkling that powder over Mr. Conrad's grave, Mr. Conrad would shortly appear, looking very annoyed at the forced return, and commence writing. I would leave for London early tomorrow morning with a sausage grinder. Hemingway went on to assert, from nothing else that I've ever read have I gotten what every book of Conrad has given me. Both Hemingway and Fitzgerald noted Conrad's narrative style as deeply influential upon their conception of narrative shape and design, with Fitzgerald writing to Hemingway that the dying fall of Conrad's closing pages appealed to the, quote, lingering after effects in the reader's mind. Some critics see in the closing lines of Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby an echo, conscious or subconscious, of Heart of Darkness. Fitzgerald writes, "So we beat on, boats, against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." Conrad closes his novella, "The offing was barred by a black band of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed sombre under an overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness." The novella has continued to influence writers and artists ever since. Some critics see its influence in the book Deliverance by James Dickey and the film adaptation by John Borman, which still makes me wince at the sound of a banjo. It was a book that fascinated Orson Welles. He pitched a 174-page screenplay as his first film to a reluctant Hollywood in 1939. The norm in film scripts is a page of screenplay equals about 1 minute of screen time, so Welles's first pass ran very close to 3 hours long. Hollywood passed on the opportunity, and Welles went on with his second option instead, Citizen Kane. Conrad's book did make it to the big screen, most notably in the adaptation Apocalypse Now, with Marlon Brando in the role of Colonel Kurtz. Heart of Darkness, like many of Conrad's longer pieces, was originally conceived as a short story. In December of 1898, Conrad writes to William Blackwood about a short story submission of about 30,000 words, and perhaps a little less, for the 1000th edition of Blackwood's magazine. In that letter, 13th of December, Conrad protests that the production of the story is painfully slow. Quote, "With immense effort a thin trickle of manuscript is produced, and that, just now, must be kept in one channel only, lest no one gets anything and I am completely undone." By the end of December, Conrad shifted his sense of the story a little, conceiving The Heart of Darkness, as he originally titled it, as a piece of under 20,000 words, as I see it now. Just a couple of days later, in a letter to David Mulry, Conrad reveals that his work is already behind schedule, and then in a letter to H.G. Wells, Conrad describes the whole thing as an infernal tale. It grows like the genie from the bottle in the Arabian tale. 70 pages, pencil, pencil, since I saw you. And when he writes to Stephen Crane, he confesses, "He has not a ghost of a notion in my head, not a sentence under the pen, though he is in the middle of a rotten thing I am writing for Blackwood." As Conrad continues to write about the story, this time to Blackwood, his magazine publisher, he's more positive in his assessment. "It has grown upon me a bit," he writes. The story had not just grown on Conrad, however, it had also just grown. Instead of 2 editions of Blackwood's magazine, the extending story was stretched to 3. But the other aspect of this early periodical publication is that Conrad is still writing the tale with strict deadlines for copy submission to a periodical publication with a readership following his story in installments before it's finished. Remarking that though he is glad he wrote it, he complains candidly to Meldrum that the story is, quote, terribly bad in places and falls short of my intention as a whole. The discussion today is based on research that I've done on the manuscript version of the novella, which I've examined in terms of its pedagogical impact. How do students respond to the novella taught via the manuscript? And what amendments and omissions can we see in the manuscript? And what do they reveal about the novel in its final published form? The manuscript development of the story is interesting. It was first written, as Conrad has already noted, in pencil, in a holograph manuscript that's been digitized and made available by the Beinecke Rare Books Library at Yale. We're really fortunate to have a large number of Conrad's manuscripts available to us. It isn't luck. Conrad didn't see much financial success as a novelist until around 1914 with the publication of his novel Chance. Much of its success has been attributed to having the image of a woman on its dust jacket. This was a first for Conrad, and hence its sales numbers reflected a public perception that the novel was something of a romance. That, along with a vigorous marketing initiative from Conrad's new American publisher Doubleday, changed the financial landscape for Conrad and turned him into, really in effect, a literary superstar. Before that, Conrad struggled. And where he could, he created revenue streams in his writing. He sold his novels, of course, and anthologized his short stories in volumes of fiction. But where possible, he also marketed his pieces in periodicals, in magazines, sometimes in syndicated newspapers. Dickens, of course, did the same thing. Conrad's great book on terrorism, The Secret Agent, for example, was first published in periodical form in America in 1906, before it was published as a book in 1907, in a manuscript called Ridgway's Militant Weekly. In addition to those revenue sources, Conrad also carefully preserved his holograph manuscripts and occasionally his typescript manuscripts too, and he sold those as well. Now, many of them went to an American lawyer, a collector of fine art, and a collector of literary lost causes, to some extent, John Quinn. It was Quinn who supported Conrad financially through manuscript and draft purchases, and whom we have to thank for the extensive manuscript collection of Conrad's work. One of Conrad's manuscripts is lost. The long short story Karain was on its way to Quinn in New York, but has rested since 1912 with the other mysteries of the Titanic at the bottom of the Atlantic. Many manuscripts remain, however, and the collection was dispersed at Quinn's death through auction, and many of the pieces ended up in major American museums and libraries, like the Rosenbach in Chicago, the Berg collection at the New York Public Library, the Harry Ransom Humanities Collection in Austin, Texas, and the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale in Connecticut. And with digital humanities efforts, some of those extraordinary collections are now more widely available than ever, a boon for researchers in times as fraught with difficulty as today. I think of Conrad's manuscripts as treasure troves, to be honest, but I probably have a distorted point of view. that's not shared by many. Heart of Darkness is not quite complete. The opening 10 pages, for example, are gone. The manuscript begins for us on page 11. There's a numbering shift towards the end where Conrad, presumably working with typescript, continues to write the manuscript as he prepares it for publication in Blackwoods. It's predominantly pencil holograph, so handwritten in pencil. It has corrections both interlinear and marginal, in pencil and in pen, although pen is rare. There are typographical marks in blue pencil. Presumably these are editorial from Blackwoods, although perhaps Conrad had a hand in these as well. He sometimes tries to anticipate what editors might want to do, because there are occasional holograph corrections and even composition in blue pencil as well. There are also layout instructions for Blackwoods in red. Here, a reference to a corresponding page number of typescript, perhaps. On balance, and especially considering its early stage composition, the writing of Heart of Darkness is tight, economical, and purposeful. There are, however, profoundly fascinating moments in the choices that Conrad made to change aspects of the novella, omit parts of the narrative, and embellish the original text. While the manuscript is generally close to the novel text, some of the changes are small but profound. Numerous revisions take place on a micro level in the text. When Conrad first writes east to describe the passage taken in the steamboat's passage towards Kurtz's station, that's crossed out, becomes west, and he does the same with western in revision. Kurtz himself, the iconic figure who's passed into popular culture through Conrad's text and through the figure of Colonel Kurtz, Marlon Brando and Francis Ford Coppola's interpretation of the novella in Apocalypse Now, is originally not Kurtz at all, but Klein, a station director Conrad met in the Congo during his stint as a paddle steamer captain. Part way through the manuscript, Conrad replaces Klein with Kurtz and overwrites the instances where he used the former name. The shift between Klein, which means small in German, and Kurtz, which means short, is peculiar. Manuscript deletions, when they're marked in the manuscript, sometimes seem to be considerations of space and publication for the serial version rather than thematic, something that occurs in the manuscript of The Secret Agent as well. One such is a paragraph beginning, "They swore together," out of sheer fright, I believe. It's a page we've already seen because of the blue pencil, with a bold cross through the entire paragraph and a slash across the centre, accompanied by the question mark covering 6 lines of manuscript to the left side, asking if it should be cut. Here Marlowe is discovered listening in on the conversation of the station manager and his nephew, while they essentially plot against Kurtz. The paragraph is retained ultimately in both the serial version of the story and the novel version too, in its original form. When deletions occur during and as part of the drafting process, they're often simply reinserted some lines or paragraphs later, often word for word, or immediately mined for phrases and rewritten for clarity and effect. The closing sentence of Conrad's initial paragraph deletion, where twice he attempts to use affronted in a non-idiomatic way, is abandoned. Perhaps influenced by the French affronter, or aware of archaic usage of affront as encounter, face-to-face or confront, Conrad reveals his non-native speaker status. For years, after all, he was more proficient in French than he was in English. Clearly, when Conrad took pains to write something, he seemed loath to entirely lose his industry. This particular characteristic makes the notable excisions that we will go on to look at all the more interesting because Conrad labours over them and then discards them, something that he's generally reluctant to do. When he does cut something entirely, there's generally an important reason. Early in the manuscript, Conrad cuts a picturesque image of a steamer encountered in the night as it sails down the River Thames in the dark, while Marlowe and his friends wait for the tide to turn before they resume their journey. Marlowe observes, "The traffic of the great city went on in the deepening night upon the sleepless river. A big steamer came down all a long blaze of lights like a town viewed from the sea, bound to the uttermost ends of the earth and timed to the day, to the very hour, with nothing unknown in her path, no mystery on her way, nothing but a few coaling stations." The whole sequence, 131 words, poetic, detailed and descriptive, is cut for the novel all the way back to the opening phrase, "The traffic of the great city went on in the deepening night upon the sleepless river." There is a clear reason for Conrad's decision here, but I'm going to wait to talk about it till we look at one of the major omissions from the manuscript, when Conrad describes landfall in Africa. Aside from some of the smaller differences between the manuscript and the novel, there are some really profound moments of discordant difference. Kurtz, for example, does not write the novella postscript, "Exterminate all the brutes." In the manuscript, it's an interlinear correction to the original, "Kill every single brute of them. There you have the means." Of course, the basic intention is unambiguous in each version, but the reader impact of each is very different. The fact that Kurtz writes his genocidal threat in consecutive and fairly reasoned sentences in the first draft rings false. Kurtz is losing grip on reality and identity when he scribbles his postscript, and we're invited to see the contrast between the elegant discourse of the pamphlet from Kurtz, the celebrated European, and the coarse utterance of the postscript of a Kurtz who has embraced the wilderness within. It's interesting to watch Conrad move in his holograph revision towards a text that is so familiar to us now. If it's striking to see such a notable line missing in the initial draft, it's startling that the single most iconic moment in the text, the horror, nearly didn't make Conrad's manuscript version of the original text either. He cried at some image, at some vision. He cried with a cry that was no more than a breath. Oh, the horror. Like many of Conrad's revisions, it's an inspired choice. The horror is a moment of profound utterance beyond eloquence. And rather than speak about Kurtz's gift for expression, Marlowe simply records it in the final version, and recounts how he enters the mess hall where the pilgrims were eating, only for it all to be interrupted when the manager's boy, quote, put his insolent black head in the doorway and said in a tone of scathing contempt, "Mr. Kurtz, he dead." But the real interest in Conrad's manuscript revision and narrative choices lies in what is missing from the final version, and the most striking example of that is early on in the tale when Marlowe lands at the coast. Much of this is noteworthy, from the landing point initially identified in the manuscript as Dakar on the western tip of Africa, which is subsequently deleted from the novella, to the eventual disembarkation. Now once again, it's hard to definitively say why Conrad would delete such a detail. Perhaps he sought more of an impression than a record of the landing, or perhaps Dakar, which is several thousand miles away in Senegal, seemed too distracting a way station for a narrative about the horrors of colonial exploitation in the Congo. Whatever Conrad's reason, the omissions are more fascinating still when he recounts Marlowe's initial experience with Africa. Compare this to the Heart of Darkness you're familiar with, where Marlowe quickly establishes the scene. That scene quickly moves inland, where Marlowe records his initial impressions. Then Marlowe notices the decay and general air of dilapidation as all about him is rusted, broken and overturned. It's a prelude to the Grove of Death scene that follows immediately in the novella. I came upon a boiler wallowing in the grass, and then found a path leading up the hill. It turned aside for the boulders and also for an undersized railway truck lying there on its back with its wheels in the air. One was off. The thing looked as dead as the carcass of some animal. I came upon more pieces of decaying machinery, a stack of rusty rails. It is a more extended sequence cut from the novel, where Marlowe records his initial impressions after disembarking. It begins the same way. We went up some 20 miles and anchored off the seat of government, but it immediately changes after that. I had heard enough in Europe about its advanced state of civilization. The papers, nay, the very paper vendors in the sepulchral city, this is Brussels, were boasting about the steam tramway and the hotel, especially the hotel. I beheld that wonder. It was like a symbol at the gate. It towered. It stood alone, a grey high cube of iron with 2 tiers of galleries outside. The manuscript passage is remarkable for its incongruity with Conrad's developing theme in the finished novella. Marlowe observes in tones of wonder the engineering marvel of the steam tramway, the elegant and modern hotel towering over the scene, and this initial impression leaves a sense of civilization, grandeur, prosperity and modernity, ironically perhaps offering a validation of sorts for the great civilizing project that Conrad will excoriate through his novella. This is echoed in another deleted paragraph. Now, over all of this is an enormous baobab tree on a barren top of a hill amongst the government buildings. Conrad struggles with the image of the tree but keeps working it in revisions to move it towards his final claim with its denuded boughs, throwing itself into showy attitudes where it pretends to be a man. The whole sequence is fascinating, from the remarkable experience of new technology to the cosmopolitan den of a great city transplanted into Africa, to the soaring and exotic posturing pretense of the great tree on a hill pretending to be a man. All of it disappears in Conrad's final revision, just like the image of the steamship and the prospect of a vast globalized economy that we saw earlier. And Marlowe's journey in the novella cuts swiftly from his embarkation at the seat of government to a simplified narrative of the Swedish ship's captain and the journey to the outer station. There's no doubt that Conrad attempts to undercut the initial impressions of Africa as a place of wonder and modernity, and he suggests the facade is merely that, a front that doesn't bear much looking into. The images of the restaurant and the baobab reinforce the same idea. But there's also little doubt that Conrad had the tone of the first encounter with Africa wrong in the draft version, and the image of the boiler rusting in the grass as Marlowe wends his way towards the Grove of Death, where the machines decay like animal carcasses and the dead and dying await, is far more tonally consistent with what is to come. Students, interestingly, are very responsive to the differences between the two. Here are 2 infographics that show student responses. 70 students were surveyed. The first is the novel version of the encounter with Africa, and then the manuscript version. The more a word is mentioned in a student response, the larger the word appears in the infographic. Death and dreary abandoned decay is the big winner in the novel, while grand, civilized and prosperous dominate in the manuscript version of the encounter with Africa. Kurtz is also treated differently in the manuscript version than in the finished volume. Some of his motivation is clarified for the reader. When Kurtz heads back upriver after making the partial descent with his assistant, he does so expressly because of his jealousy of the ivory that was left behind. Why then did he go back? I asked. There was some ivory. We had left some ivory behind. Later, after Kurtz has been captured or saved, when he's heading downriver, he begs Marlowe to close the window of the cabin because of the intrusive lure of the wilderness, and then cries out in a moment of pathos, "Oh, but I will wring your heart yet." In the manuscript, the effect is very different. "Oh, but I will make you serve my ends," he cries at the invisible wilderness. But he sounds rather like a pantomime villain, shaking his fist at the jungle. The deleted section appears and is deleted on 2 consecutive pages. Significant omissions from the opening lines are worth noting, however. In the manuscript, the sequence begins, "I think the knowledge came to him at last. If so, then justice was done." And that kind of moral judgment is largely missing from the novella in its finished form. The great lie of the novel, of course, is the nature of Kurtz himself, a realization shared, to a degree, with the reader, and hidden from Kurtz's fiancée at the end of the story, in the same way that the reality of the colonial projects in Africa was largely sanitized for domestic Victorian audiences. In the manuscript version of the novella, right before Marlowe meets with the intended, there's a moment within the Kurtz material deleted from the published novella, where Kurtz's eloquence is set free and he's finally allowed to speak. In that moment, Kurtz reveals himself with a startlingly graphic confession. "I have lived supremely. I have been dead and damned. Let me go. I want more of it." More of what? Marlowe wonders. More blood, more heads on stakes, more adoration, rapine, and murder. Conrad revises the novella on the principle that the more concretely Kurtz's depravity and degeneration is described, the less the audience is likely to empathize with him. Too much disclosure about Kurtz renders him unknowable, less one of us than he might be if his wickedness was so explicit as to make him more monster than human. The revisions clearly suggest, interestingly, that in the finished novel he is human, elusive and human, and all the more damning indictment of colonial brutality because of it. Remember that Conrad had served in Africa himself as a steamboat captain of the Roi de Belge, but he had also experienced colonial brutality as a Pole under Russian oppression. Kurtz is the emblem of what Conrad describes in his novel as just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. The treatment of Kurtz, and even of landfall in Africa itself, might remind us of an aesthetic principle that Conrad declared in a 1922 letter to Richard Curl. "It is a strange fate that everything that I have of said artistic purpose labour to leave indefinite, suggestive, in the penumbra of initial inspiration, should have that light turned on it and its insignificance exposed for any fool to comment upon, or even for average minds to be disappointed with. Didn't it ever occur to you, my dear Curl, that I knew what I was doing in leaving the facts of my life and even of my tales in the background? Explicitness, my dear fellow, is fatal to the glamour of all artistic work, robbing it of all suggestiveness, destroying all illusion." In many respects, manuscript study, looking at inception and genesis of a text, takes us right into that penumbra of initial inspiration. Penumbra is a edge of a darker shadow, a sort of twilight, if you like, around the edges of a heart of darkness. What we do in literature studies is essentially complex pattern recognition. We're trying to identify threads of intricately woven patterns to understand their relationships to one another and to understand ourselves. When we examine a piece of literature, we pull at the threads revealed in the published text to find the pattern, to understand how it all fits together, to understand what it is to be human. There are all sorts of threads woven in as well, depending on the kinds of critical lenses that we're using to understand what we're looking at. Perhaps biographical or historical threads, psychological, cultural, political, or how the text fits into broader patterns of period, of genre, of oeuvre. In Genesis and Inception studies, we're introducing a whole new range of threads into these already complex patterns, often chaotic and confused, unfinished, protean, and dynamic. Part of the unpublished text, these new elements may help us understand the published text and the writer's process, what he was thinking, what he was trying to do while he was writing the piece, or they may confuse or distract us because, of course, much of what does not make it into a final text is unselected for a variety of different reasons. I'm certainly guilty, however, of trying to shine a light into the shadows, trying to unravel some of the mysteries that Conrad so determinedly constructed in his fictional worlds. In the finished novel, Conrad shades the figure of Kurtz more ambivalently than in the manuscript, and he selects carefully from his encounter with Africa to create vivid impressions on the reader and shape the sensory experience of Africa for European and American audiences that continue to move and challenge us today. But what he chooses not to select is fascinating too. The modernity of the African project, the ruthlessness of the colonial experience, the scale of Kurtz's wickedness. If you remember the deleted steamer that Conrad writes about, the ship running to a rigid timetable like a lighted city on the water, Conrad also chooses to obscure the headlong tilt towards globalism on a startling scale, and the imperiousness of ruthless efficiency. And he does this so that readers can discover the patterns for themselves. This is something that he not only witnessed but participated in as a sea captain in the Merchant Navy. These elements hide in the shadows of the novel and are only fully illuminated in the manuscript. Interestingly, Conrad sought the same kind of obscurity, sharing details of his own life, recounting his decision to leave Poland and turn to the sea. Conrad suggests that he was a quixotic youth seeking high adventure. The reality is he was also the son of a political criminal because of his parents' role in Polish insurrection against Russia, and therefore subject to conscription in the Russian army. He tells the story of a daring duel and wounding in his youth when he first arrives in France, and his flight from Russian influence, and he even features it in a late novel. Again, the intention there is to mythologize, but current understanding is that this was a failed suicide attempt after the 17-year-old Conrad had fallen in with a dissolute crowd and squandered his family allowance. Presumably for convalescence from that injury, his guardian, Tadeusz Bobrowski, found him lengthy passage on a small sailing ship, the Mont Blanc. He remained at sea thereafter until he became a novelist. Now he served in the British Merchant Marine and began to improve his English because they had no extradition treaties with Russia, unlike the French. Resiliency and restoration in the face of adversity. In flight, the expatriate Pole, young Joseph Conrad, as he would come to be known, found a career and a language which he would make all his own. And he would begin a journey, one that irrevocably led him towards the heart of darkness that we have before us today.